American voters are bearish on American democracy, with nearly half saying that our system of government does not do a good job representing their interests. And that's according to a new New York Times Siena College poll. So let's put this graph up. Let's show you some of these results. It finds that 49% of Americans say that American democracy does a good job representing the people. But 45% disagree and think that it does not do a good job representing the people. And the results are even more interesting when you break it down further in regard to whether Americans are going to believe that the election results are legitimate or not. Now, a majority of voters do believe that the country is plagued by corruption, with 62% saying that the government is mostly working to benefit itself and elites rather than the common good. And Randall Parr, who's a retired farmer in Indiana, told the Times that the Washington elite control everything and the will of the people has been ignored. And it's not just Democrat or Republican, it's the Washington elite. There's just too much money floating around by lobbyists that are corrupting Washington, D.C., and it's tearing us all apart. Randall Parr is incredibly smart and knows exactly what's going on. So when you have the Harris campaign move away from any messaging in regard to economic policies or what she intends to do as president should she get elected, and instead focuses on vote for me because I'm gonna help protect democracy, you can understand why that messaging doesn't work when our democratic process, according to polling and how the respondents responded to the poll, indicates that this democracy hasn't really worked out so well for them and hasn't represented their best interests. So it does create an environment in which an anti-establishment individual like Donald Trump, who's really like a human version of the middle finger to the establishment, rises up and garners a lot of support because he's trashing the very system that I think a lot of Americans are pretty furious about.
Yeah, so Randall Parr speaks for the entirety of the country. And all these things depend on how you ask the question, because even the 62% saying that the government mostly working for the benefit of itself rather than the elites rather than the common good, that's even low. Because when you ask the question this way, do the politicians work for their donors or their voters? That poll, now this was a number of years back, but that poll came in at 93%. So we all know that they work for their donors. Those 7% who say that they don't work for their donors all work in mainstream media. So they put on a play, and then, so in this case, both corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans gorge themselves on donor money. They do everything their donors ask them. Here on the Young Turks, we predict what's gonna happen in bills. We're almost never wrong because it's the easiest thing in the world. Follow the money. Whoever has more money wins every time when it comes to legislation. By the way, in congressional elections, whoever has more money wins 95% of the time. But the jokers in mainstream media are like, donors? What's the donors? And them having an influence? Oh, no, they would never influence these saintly politicians. Well, okay, that's why nobody believes you. And that's why when the Democrats say, hey, we're protecting democracy, a lot of people in the country go, are you? Because I don't see you representing me, I see you representing your donors. Now that's also true of the Republicans. And for Trump, he not only has the same exact systemic corruption, bragging nonstop about how he pleases his donors. Oh, Elon gave me a strong endorsement now for electric vehicles. I mean, he's just brazen, he just says it. He layers on personal corruption on top of that. Yeah, that's worse, but that's not a great campaign. Hey, we 98% of the time we represent our donors, but the other guys are slightly worse than us. Wow, you must be so proud.
Yeah, and it is interesting because as corruption infects both parties similarly, and as both parties fail over and over again to represent the best interests of their base and the electorate, what ends up happening is they lean into either culture war messaging, which further rips the country apart, or in the case of the Democratic Party, they lean into messaging about how we must support them because they're the only ones who are going to protect liberal democracy. But only 7% of the voters said that democracy was the most important factor motivating their vote. So when you have trashed our democracy, and then intend to run a campaign that centers democracy as like the primary feature, It's not gonna work. You actually have to do more than that. You have to show Americans and your base why democracy is important to protect. You have to show that the democratic process serves the best interests of the people. Yeah. But that's not what we've been getting from Democrats or Republicans for that matter. So this is an issue, guys. I need you to understand why the electorate feels this way.
They're not wrong. And what drives me crazy about the mainstream media is that then they'll blame the voters. And they'll say, oh, this loss in faith in democracy. Tut, tut. It's all your fault. How dare you think that democracy is endangered by the Democrats? And in that case, it's not the Democrats, guys. And the mainstream media misunderstands this too. It is the establishment in both parties. And of course, I think that the people who say, I hate that system, hence I'm gonna go for the meteor, the IED, the hand grenade named Donald Trump, right? And I'm saying that symbolically, rhetorically, politically, right? I'll just go for that guy because the establishment seems to hate him. That's why they're doing it. Every time I say that on social media or I say it to a conservative that's come on here to debate us, they go, goddamn right, that's why we like Donald Trump, because he takes on the establishment and the establishment hates him and the establishment is corrupt. And when Democrats and the media deny that, they lose all credibility. So that's why nobody believes you anymore. But keep going, keep saying the politicians are having debates. They're not having debates. They're all sellouts. They all represent their donors. And the fact that no one on cable news ever says that is, remember Chris Cuomo pointed out the donors at the DNC just a couple of months ago? And that was big news, even though he's now just on News Nation, which is much, much smaller, right? They're like, wow, a small cable station once pointed out that the donors might be in charge. Wow, what a big news story. Of course the donors are in charge. And if you take us for fools, it's hard not to dislike you.
The media is currently celebrating the fact that Kamala Harris was able to raise $1 billion for a campaign. They're celebrating it. It is a metric for celebration in the mainstream press.
And let me build off of that, because that's so true, but there's a much more nefarious part of that. So at the congressional level and at the Senate level, where there is not as much media attention, at least at the presidential level, you kind of know who Kamala Harris, you certainly know who Donald Trump is, right? But at the congressional level, whenever an article is written or it's mentioned in the news, they'll say, Bob Smith, who's leading the race by having raised $24 million, they make it seem like Bob Smith is a well-accomplished guy, an incredible guy, the leader, the one you should think about voting for. Number one, Bob Smith. Why? Because he took the most bribes. How is that a positive? But they universally paint it as the most positive thing in the whole wide world. Oh, but Sally Jones is coming in second, raising $22 million. This progressive who represents real Americans has only raised $500,000. That guy's a loser. Yeah, it's a guy who's trying to upset the race. He's just a fringe candidate, right? So the media has doomed us all. Mainstream media is junk, total, utter trash, sitting there constantly pleasuring the politicians. Oh, we need access to them. We need access to them.
So both members of both parties overwhelmingly agree that democracy is actually under threat, which I thought was also an interesting result of this New York Times Siena College poll. Republicans believe that Kamala Harris, Biden, and the Democratic Party in general is bad for democracy. And then, do I really need to explain the Democratic side and how they feel the Republicans are a threat to democracy? Obviously, they feel that way. They have literally centered that issue as the main part of their campaigning and Kamala Harris's platform. Now, for Democrats, Trump is the only thing they cite, whereas for Republicans, they mention other figures, including Kamala Harris, Biden, and the Democratic Party in general. But when asked about his recent threats that he might need to use the National Guard to handle Americans whom he called the enemy from within, just under half of all voters, including a quarter of Republicans, said they took Trump's comments seriously. So even some Republican voters take those comments seriously. Now, Trump supporters usually insist that the former president shouldn't be taken literally when he says these types of things or these types of statements, but the results suggest that voters agree that when he makes these types of statements, they should be taken seriously. Now, this poll also contains a bit of good news. So this gave me a little bit of hope because I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of worry that if one candidate or the other doesn't totally wipe out their opponent, if there isn't a strong enough lead in the election results, well then that could lead to disputes, that could lead to rioting and all sorts of violence. But nearly 80% of voters, including a majority of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, trust that the 2024 presidential election results will be accurate.
Hey, that's our second silver lining of the show. So that's a good number, and it's risen. It used to be 70%, now it's 80%. It looks like some of the Republicans are waking up to the fact that Donald Trump is full of crap, and he didn't win the 2020 election, and he's just a spoiled baby who keeps crying about it and trying to undermine democracy. That's why he's slipping with senior voters. Like, look, man, both these candidates are desperately trying to lose. If Donald Trump didn't keep talking about 2020, he would definitely have the lead, and I think he would coast to victory. But he's bleeding senior voters in a way that people didn't expect, and he's now starting to lose some non-college educated white voters. I think that they're concerned because he keeps saying, I'm going to target the enemies from within. That's terrible talk. That's terrible. Whatever word and terminology you want to put on it, that's not what we do as Americans. We don't attack one another, and we certainly don't want our leader using the military or anything else as he's threatened to do. And he recently, before he talked about using the entire military when he was in office, but his own team stopped him. And now he's talking about using the National Guard against protesters. This isn't what we do, man. This isn't who we are. So, but I'm really encouraged to see that 80% of the country now realizes the election was real in 2020. Look, last thing here. Guys, we lost democracy a long time ago. So I wrote about this in my book. We talked about it on the Young Turks when the study first came out. Princeton and Northwestern did a study. This was even before Citizens United. Citizens United shot a dead horse. They legalized bribery in this country in 76 to 78. An activist Supreme Court did that, led by Lewis Powell. And so I wrote about it at length at Justice is Coming. David Stroder's got a great podcast at The Lever about it. Make sure you check that out. And so because of that, when the political scientists did that study, they studied 20 years and about nearly 2,000 bills. The top 10% in this country in wealth had a significant effect on legislation. Not a complete effect, but if they wanted a bill, it had a really good chance of passing. The bottom 90%, you know what effect we had? Zero. None whatsoever. Post Citizens United, I mean, you can't get lower than zero. We don't have a democracy. The rich rule us. And the job of mainstream media is to lie to you about it and get you to believe that they don't. The donors are 100% in charge in both parties.
Hey, thanks for watching that video. We really appreciate it, guys. And we appreciate it if you become members because that allows us to be independent, honest, progressive, all the things that you don't get from corporate media. And all of that is because of you guys. Hit the join button below and become one of us, become a Young Turk.